Behind the glittering facade of Graceland's gates, a young woman lived a double life that would shock the world. While Elvis Presley commanded stages across America, his wife Priscilla wasn't sitting quietly at home as the dutiful spouse the public imagined. She was dancing in underground clubs, forming secret friendships with Hollywood rebels, taking karate lessons that bordered on obsession, and exploring a world of freedom that would ultimately tear apart the most famous marriage in rock and roll history. The woman America thought they knew was living dangerously close to the edge, and the consequences would change everything. The silence at Graceland was deafening when Elvis left for another tour. As his Cadillac disappeared down the tree-lined driveway, Priscilla Presley would wait exactly 30 minutes before her real day began. The perfectly coiffed hair would come down, the demure dresses would be replaced with tight jeans and leather jackets, and the obedient wife would transform into someone Elvis would barely recognize by 1970. Priscilla had perfected the art of living two completely different lives. During the day, she maintained the image Elvis and his management team had carefully crafted for her, the devoted wife who waited patiently at home, managing the household staff and attending charity events with other music industry wives. But when darkness fell over Memphis, a different Priscilla emerged from the shadows of Graceland's colonial columns. Her first act of rebellion had been small, sneaking out to local Memphis clubs while Elvis performed in Las Vegas. She discovered a vibrant underground scene that existed parallel to the polished world of country clubs and society galas she was expected to inhabit. These weren't the upscale venues where wives of celebrities were supposed to be seen. These were gritty, authentic places where she could disappear into crowds of young people who had no idea who she was. The thrill was intoxicating. For the first time since moving to Graceland as a teenager, Priscilla felt truly alive. She learned to dance to James Brown and Aretha Franklin, music that Elvis dismissed as beneath his artistic vision. She engaged in conversations about politics, civil rights, and the changing world outside the protective bubble of Elvis's empire. These weren't discussions about hairstyles or fashion. They were real conversations with real people who saw her as more than just an extension of her famous husband. But it wasn't just about the music or the dancing. In these clubs, Priscilla discovered parts of herself that had been suppressed for years. She had opinions about the Vietnam War that differed from Elvis's patriotic stance. She was curious about the feminist movement that was gaining momentum across America. She found herself drawn to the raw energy of protest songs and counterculture movements that her husband viewed with suspicion and disdain. As weeks turned into months, Priscilla's secret nighttime adventures became more elaborate and more dangerous. She began using aliases, creating entire fictional backgrounds for herself. To some, she was Patricia, a secretary from downtown Memphis. To others, she was Scylla, a college student exploring the city's nightlife. Each identity allowed her to explore different aspects of her personality that had been carefully edited out of her public persona. The staff at Graceland began to notice subtle changes. Priscilla would sleep later in the mornings, claiming headaches that kept her in her room until noon. She started wearing sunglasses more frequently, even indoors, and her usual punctuality at social events began to slip. Most concerning to those who knew her well was the spark of something dangerous in her eyes, a restless energy that hadn't been there during the early years of her marriage. Everything changed the night Priscilla met Mike Stone. It was 1972, and Elvis had insisted she take karate lessons for self-defense, never imagining that his suggestion would introduce his wife to the man who would become her greatest secret, and ultimately contribute to the destruction of their marriage. Stone wasn't just any karate instructor. He was a champion, a rebel, and everything that Elvis was not. Where Elvis was soft around the edges from years of prescription medication and rich food, Mike Stone was disciplined and physically powerful. Where Elvis surrounded himself with yes-men and hangers-on, Stone was independent and brutally honest. Where Elvis lived in a fantasy world of his own creation, Stone was grounded in reality, focused on goals that had nothing to do with fame or fortune. The attraction was immediate and dangerous. Priscilla had never experienced the kind of intense adult relationship that developed between her and Stone. Her relationship with Elvis had begun when she was barely 14, shaped by his needs and his vision of who she should become. With Stone, she was discovering who she actually was, not the girl Elvis had molded, but the woman she was capable of becoming. Their training sessions became the highlight of Priscilla's week. She would arrive early and stay late, pushing her body to limits she never knew existed. Stone taught her more than fighting techniques. He taught her discipline, focus, and most importantly, that she was capable of being strong in ways that had nothing to do with her famous husband. For the first time in her adult life, Priscilla was being challenged intellectually and physically by someone who saw her potential rather than her limitations. The physical transformation was remarkable. Priscilla developed lean muscle, improved posture, and a confidence in her body that was evident to everyone around her. But the mental transformation was even more dramatic. Stone encouraged her to question assumptions, to think critically about her life choices, and to consider what she wanted rather than what was expected of her. Their conversations extended far beyond martial arts philosophy. Stone was politically aware in ways that Elvis deliberately was not, preferring to avoid controversial topics that might alienate his diverse fan base. Stone talked about social justice, about the changing role of women in American society, about the importance of personal authenticity over public image. These were conversations that Priscilla had been hungry for without even realizing it. As their relationship deepened, the training sessions became elaborate cover-ups for spending time together. Priscilla would tell the Graceland staff she was attending extended karate workshops or competitions in other cities. In reality, she and Stone would spend entire weekends together, exploring a relationship that was everything her marriage was not: equal, passionate, and based on mutual respect rather than control. The danger of discovery only added to the intensity. Every moment they spent together was stolen time, made more precious by its forbidden nature. Priscilla began to understand what it felt like to be chosen for who she was, rather than molded into someone else's ideal. Stone saw her as a complete person, intelligent, capable, and deserving of a partnership rather than a pedestal. The double life was taking its toll. The constant deception, the elaborate alibis, and the emotional strain of living authentically with Stone while maintaining her role as Elvis's wife was exhausting. Priscilla found herself becoming increasingly resentful of the golden cage that Graceland represented, even as she continued to play her part in the public spectacle of her marriage. As Elvis's tours grew longer and more frequent, Priscilla's secret life expanded beyond Memphis into the glittering, treacherous world of Hollywood. She had always been drawn to the movie industry, but now she wasn't content to be a celebrity, wife attending premieres and charity galas. She wanted to be part of the creative process, to understand the industry from the inside rather than observing it from the protected periphery of Elvis's fame. Her entry point was through a group of young actors and filmmakers who were part of Hollywood's emerging counterculture scene. These weren't the established stars who socialized with Elvis in his circle. They were hungry, rebellious artists who were challenging the studio system and creating independent films that reflected the changing social landscape of America. In the early 1970s, Dot, through her karate instructor Mike Stone, who had connections throughout the entertainment industry as a stunt coordinator and fight choreographer, Priscilla met directors like Dennis Hopper and actors like Jack Nicholson during their early experimental years. These men saw her not as Elvis Presley's wife, but as an intelligent, beautiful woman who was clearly trapped in a situation that was stifling her potential. The Hollywood parties she attended in secret were unlike anything in her previous experience. Instead of the carefully orchestrated events at Graceland, where every guest was screened and every conversation monitored by Elvis's security team, these gatherings were organic, intellectual, and often lasted until dawn. People talked about art, politics, and philosophy with a passion that was completely absent from her official social circle. Priscilla began to experiment with a more bohemian style during these Hollywood excursions. Gone were the perfectly coordinated outfits and elaborate hairstyles that Elvis preferred. Instead, she embraced the natural, effortless look that was becoming popular among young women of her generation. Long, straight hair, minimal makeup, and clothes that emphasized comfort and personal expression over formal elegance. But it wasn't just about fashion or socializing. Priscilla was seriously considering pursuing acting herself, something that would have been unthinkable within the confines of her marriage. Elvis had always been threatened by any suggestion that his wife might have professional ambitions of her own. He preferred her to remain focused on supporting his career and maintaining their home, rather than developing independent interests that might take attention away from him. The movie industry connections also introduced Priscilla to recreational drug use that was becoming common in Hollywood circles. While Elvis was becoming increasingly dependent on prescription medications for his various health issues, Priscilla was experimenting with marijuana and occasionally stronger substances that were part of the creative scene she was exploring. This wasn't self-destructive behavior. It was part of her journey toward understanding herself outside the restrictive environment of her marriage. Her new friends encouraged her to think about what she wanted to do with her life beyond being Mrs. Elvis Presley. They introduced her to feminist literature, to books and movies that challenged traditional gender roles, and to the idea that she could create an identity for herself that wasn't defined by her relationship to a famous man. The contrast between her two worlds was becoming increasingly stark and difficult to maintain. At Graceland, she was expected to be grateful for her privileged position, to focus on domestic concerns, and to present the perfect image of marital contentment. In Hollywood, she was encouraged to question everything, to explore her potential, and to consider the possibility of a completely different kind of life. As 1973 approached, Priscilla realized that she was no longer the same person who had married Elvis Presley. The experiences, relationships, and self-discovery of her secret life had changed her in ways that couldn't be hidden indefinitely. The question was no longer whether Elvis would discover her double life, but whether she would have the courage to choose authenticity over security when the inevitable confrontation finally arrived. By late 1973, Priscilla's carefully constructed double life was beginning to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. The woman who had learned to compartmentalize her existence so perfectly was finding it increasingly difficult to switch between her roles as the dutiful wife at Graceland and the independent woman she had become during Elvis's absences. The two identities were no longer compatible, and something had to give. The crisis came to a head during Elvis's extended engagement in Las Vegas. What was supposed to be a routine few weeks of his residency at the International Hotel became a months-long commitment that pushed both their marriage and Priscilla's secret life to the breaking point. Elvis, consumed by his performances and increasingly dependent on prescription medications, barely noticed that his wife seemed different when she joined him in Nevada for brief visits. But the changes in Priscilla were impossible to ignore for those who knew her well. Her mother, Anne Beaulieu, noticed during a phone call that her daughter's voice carried a new confidence, almost defiance. The Graceland staff observed that Mrs. Presley seemed restless and distracted, spending hours on mysterious phone calls and receiving mail that she collected personally, rather than allowing the usual staff screening. Most significantly, Priscilla had stopped trying to please Elvis in the small ways that had characterized their relationship for over a decade. She no longer adjusted her schedule around his erratic sleep patterns when he was home. She stopped asking his opinion about her appearance or her plans for the day. She began making decisions about household matters, social commitments, and even financial arrangements without consulting him first. The transformation was most evident in their physical relationship. The intimacy that had once defined their marriage had been gradually declining for years, partly due to Elvis's health issues and medication dependency, but also because Priscilla had discovered what real passion felt like with Mike Stone. She could no longer pretend to be satisfied with the occasional, perfunctory encounters that had replaced the romance of their early years together. Elvis's response to these changes was predictable but explosive. The man who had always maintained complete control over his wife's life suddenly found himself dealing with a woman who was no longer willing to be controlled. Their arguments became more frequent and more intense, often centering around issues that seemed trivial but represented much larger questions about power, freedom, and mutual respect in their relationship. The final confrontation came in February 1972, though the details would remain private for years. Priscilla had returned from what she claimed was a karate tournament in California, but her story contained inconsistencies that Elvis's security team noticed and reported. When pressed for details about her activities, Priscilla made a decision that would change everything. She told him the truth about Mike Stone. The revelation didn't just destroy Elvis's trust in his wife. It shattered his entire worldview about their relationship and his role as the dominant partner in their marriage. The woman he had shaped and controlled since she was barely more than a child had not only developed an independent life, but had found someone who offered her something he couldn't or wouldn't provide: respect, equality, and genuine partnership. Elvis's reaction was characteristic of his personality: dramatic, self-pitying, and ultimately focused on his own wounded pride rather than any genuine attempt to understand what had driven his wife to seek fulfillment outside their marriage. He threatened Mike Stone, considered having him beaten or worse, and alternately begged Priscilla to end the relationship and demanded that she choose between her lover and her luxurious lifestyle at Graceland. Priscilla had already made her choice. The months of living authentically, even in secret, had shown her what was possible. She had discovered that she was capable of being more than Elvis Presley's wife. She could be a complete person with her own interests, relationships, and goals. The security and status that came with being married to one of the most famous men in the world no longer seemed worth the price she was paying in terms of personal fulfillment and self-respect. The divorce proceedings would be handled quietly and efficiently, with both parties maintaining public dignity while privately dealing with the wreckage of their relationship. But for Priscilla, the end of her marriage wasn't a tragedy. It was the beginning of the life she had been secretly preparing for during all those nights when Elvis was away on tour. Priscilla Presley's secret life during Elvis's touring years reveals a woman who refused to be defined solely by her famous marriage. Her journey from submissive teenager to independent woman wasn't just personal rebellion. It was a reflection of the broader social changes happening in America during the 1970s. Her story demonstrates that even those who seem to have everything may be searching for something more valuable than wealth and fame: authentic self-expression and genuine partnership, ready to discover more untold stories from music. History's most fascinating figures? Subscribe to our newsletter for exclusive content about the secret lives of celebrities, the hidden dramas behind famous relationships, and the real stories that shaped popular culture. Don't miss the revelations that will change how you see your favorite stars forever.